Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The thing about working as a cultural liaison aboard an interstellar diplomatic vessel, Violet had learned over the past 8 months, was that nobody actually knew what a cultural liaison was supposed to do. The job description had been vague at best, criminally optimistic at worst, and somewhere in the middle sat her actual daily reality. A chaotic mess of paperwork, mistranslated dinner menus, and explaining to various alien species why humans found certain tentacle gestures offensive. The Dawnbreaker was humanity's pride and joy, a diplomatic cruiser designed to house representatives from 24 species in something approaching harmony. Mostly, it succeeded. Sometimes it resulted in Violet mediating arguments about temperature settings, protein preferences, and that one memorable incident where Ambassador Quellen had accidentally declared war via what he thought was a friendly wave. Right now, standing outside the Draxi quarters with a lukewarm cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, Violet was reconsidering every life choice that had led her to this moment. The Draxi were, without question, the most intimidating species on the ship. Picture bipedal panthers, if panthers stood 2.5 meters tall, possessed obsidian fur that seemed to absorb light, and had retractable claws that could slice through hull plating. Their eyes glowed amber in the dark. Their movements were liquid grace mixed with coiled violence, and their reputation preceded them by about 3 star systems. Undefeated in combat for 3 generations. A warrior culture so deeply ingrained that their children learned battle stances before they learned to read. The kind of species that made hardened military officers suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. And Violet, exhausted and running on approximately 4 hours of sleep, was about to babysit 2 of their cubs. Well, not babysit. Ambassador Moran had been very clear about that when he'd approached her in the mess hall that morning, his massive frame somehow folding into a posture that almost looked apologetic. The Draxi didn't do babysitters, he'd explained in his rumbling bass voice. They did tutors, combat instructors, tactical advisors. But his twin cubs, Fawn and Lynx, were struggling with standard galactic immersion, and their previous tutor had quit after Fawn had bitten through his datapad. Not in anger, Moran had assured her, just curiosity and teething. Draxi cubs teethed until they were 4, apparently, which explained so much, and yet somehow made everything worse. Violet had asked the obvious question, why her? Why a human? Why not literally anyone else? Moran had fixed her with those unsettling amber eyes and said something that still rattled around in her head. I've watched you work. You don't flinch. You don't perform. You simply are. My cubs need someone who won't treat them like weapons in training. Which was, honestly, probably the nicest thing anyone had said about her chronic exhaustion and complete lack of self-preservation instincts. So here she was, coffee cup in one hand, a battered physical book in the other, about to walk into the quarters of the ship's apex predators for what Moran had promised would be just 1 session, see how it goes. The door slid open before she could knock. Moran stood there, somehow managing to look both regal and frazzled, a combination Violet hadn't known was possible until she'd met alien parents. Violet, thank you for coming. He stepped aside, gesturing her in with one clawed hand. The cubs are eager. Eager turned out to be a diplomatic way of saying bouncing off the walls. The Draxi quarters were spacious, decorated in what Violet had started thinking of as minimalist warrior chic, all clean lines and dark metals with the occasional weapon mounted on the wall like art, which, she supposed, It was. And in the center of this carefully organized space were two small tornadoes of black fur and barely contained energy. Fawn spotted her first. The cub froze mid-pounce, her amber eyes going wide. She was slightly smaller than her brother, with a distinctive white patch on her chest that looked almost like a flower, hence the name. Her ears swiveled forward with laser focus. Lynx, marginally calmer, sat back on his haunches, tail swishing with barely restrained curiosity. He had the same obsidian fur as his sister, but with silver-tipped ears that gave him an oddly distinguished look for someone who still had kit fuzz. For a long moment, nobody moved. Violet could feel Moran's tension radiating behind her, could sense this was some kind of test she hadn't studied for. So she did what she always did when confronted with the unknown. She sat down, right there on the floor, cross-legged, book in her lap. Didn't approach, didn't talk, didn't try to make herself smaller or less threatening. Just existed. Fawn's head tilted so far sideways, Violet worried about vertebrae. "You smell weird," the cub announced in heavily accented Standard Galactic. "Not food weird, just weird." "Fawn," Moran's voice held a warning. "It's accurate," Violet said, taking a sip of her cold coffee and grimacing. "I probably smell like recycled air and poor life choices. Want to hear a story?" Lynx's ears perked up. "Story?" "Yeah. You know, made-up stuff about made-up people doing made-up things. Your dad said you're learning Standard Galactic. Stories are good for that. Plus, they're fun, which is more than I can say for most language immersion programs I've seen." She opened the book, a genuine paper artifact that had cost her a small fortune to bring aboard. The pages were worn, the spine cracked from repeated readings. It had been her grandmother's, then her mother's, then hers. She'd brought it to space because, well, some things you didn't leave behind. Fawn crept closer, low to the ground, moving with that predator's caution that was probably instinct. Lynx followed, slightly more bold, until they were both within arm's reach. Violet didn't reach out, didn't try to touch, just started reading. Once upon a time, in a forest so deep that sunlight forgot its name, there lived a fox who was too clever for her own good, and a pack of wolves who were too proud for theirs. Her voice fell into the rhythm she remembered from childhood, when her mother had read these same words. Not performative, not dramatic, just steady, real. Fawn sat down with a thump. Lynx's tail stopped swishing. Violet kept reading, watching their faces from the corner of her eye. They were tracking every word. Yes, but more than that. They were tracking her. The way humans leaned in when something mattered. The way her voice lifted at questions, dropped at revelations. Language wasn't just words, it was music, and these two were learning the melody. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Violet's voice was getting rough, her exhaustion catching up, but the cubs were riveted. Fawn kept interrupting with questions, each one showing a mind that was sharp as her claws. Lynx stayed quiet, but his eyes never left the book, like he was memorizing every page. The fox looked at the wolf and said, "Strength isn't just what you can break. Sometimes it's what you choose not to." Violet closed the book softly. And that's chapter 1. "More," Fawn demanded immediately. "Fawn," Moran said, appearing from wherever he'd retreated to give them space. "Violet has other duties." "Actually," Violet said, surprising herself, "I could do another chapter, if that's okay." The look Moran gave her was complicated. Grateful, yes, but also something else. Hopeful, maybe. Like she'd just offered something more valuable than she knew. "One more chapter," he agreed. Violet opened the book again. Chapter 2, in which the fox learns that pride and prejudice are basically the same thing with different marketing. Fawn laughed, a sound somewhere between a chirp and a growl. Lynx shuffled closer until his shoulder was almost touching Violet's knee. And Violet, exhausted and confused, and somehow exactly where she needed to be, kept reading. By the time she finished Chapter 2, both cubs were leaning against her legs, their body heat radiating through her uniform. It should have been terrifying. These were predators, apex hunters, creatures that could probably take down a grown human without breaking a sweat. Instead, it felt like babysitting her cousin's kids back on Earth. Chaotic, demanding, and weirdly peaceful all at once. Tomorrow? Lynx asked quietly when she closed the book. More story tomorrow? Violet looked at Moran, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Yeah, she said, pushing herself to her feet with joints that protested the movement. Tomorrow. Same time? Same time, Fawn agreed, then did something that made Violet's heart skip. She rubbed her head against Violet's hand in what was unmistakably affection. Violet's hand moved on instinct, scratching behind the cub's ears. Fawn's purr was immediate and loud enough to vibrate the floor. Oh, we're in trouble now, Violet muttered, but she was smiling. As she left the quarters, book tucked under her arm, she caught sight of something in the shadows of the corridor. A massive Draxi warrior, even larger than Moran, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. His armor marked him as elite guard, the kind of soldier who'd probably forgotten more about combat than most species would ever learn. Their eyes met for a brief second. His were cold, calculating, deeply suspicious. Then he turned and walked away, silent as smoke. Violet shivered despite the ship's climate control and headed back to her quarters. She had a feeling her nice, simple, one-session story time had just gotten a lot more complicated. Behind her, through the still-open door, she could hear Fawn's excited voice. Papa, the fox is going to teach the wolves about friendship, and then they're going to fight a bear together, right? That's what happens? And Moran's deep chuckle. I suppose we'll find out tomorrow, little one. Violet smiled all the way back to her quarters, even as exhaustion pulled at her bones. Tomorrow, then. She could do tomorrow. She'd worry about the suspicious warrior and the implications of cross-species story time later. Much later. Possibly after sleep, if she ever remembered what that felt like. For now, she had aliens who wanted to hear about a clever fox and proud wolves. And somehow, that was enough. Tomorrow became the day after, which became a week, which became the strangest routine Violet had ever established in her life. Every evening at 1900 hours, she would arrive at the Draxi quarters with her book, her cold coffee, and an ever-growing sense that she'd stumbled into something much bigger than language lessons. The Cubs' standard galactic improved at a rate that made their previous tutor's failure look almost criminal. But it wasn't just vocabulary they were absorbing. They were learning the rhythm of human communication, the spaces between words where meaning lived, the way a pause could say more than a paragraph. The fox was barking up the wrong tree, Fawn announced proudly one evening, using an idiom Violet had mentioned 3 days prior. That's technically correct, Violet said, trying not to laugh. Though in this context, the fox is actually in the tree, so maybe she's barking down at the wrong wolf? Lynx, who'd been listening with his characteristic quiet intensity, spoke up. Humans have strange trees if barking involves them. It's a metaphor, bud. It means she was approaching the problem wrong. Why not just say that? Because humans like making everything complicated. It's kind of our thing. Fawn rolled onto her back, paws in the air. Humans are weird, says the species that considers ritual combat an appropriate greeting. That's only for formal occasions, Lynx said seriously. Informal greetings are just mild threats. Violet snorted coffee through her nose, which hurt, but was worth it for the confused look on both cubs' faces. The sessions had developed their own ecosystem. Fawn asked approximately 8,000 questions per chapter. Lynx absorbed everything silently, then demonstrated perfect recall days later. They'd both started correcting each other's grammar, which led to wrestling matches that Violet had learned to simply read over, raising her voice only when the volume of growling made it necessary. Moran would appear at the end of each session with what Violet had started thinking of as his proud parent face, which looked fearsome to anyone who didn't know him, but was actually just a Draxi smile. He never interrupted, never interfered, just watched from the doorway with an expression that made Violet uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate. But it wasn't just Moran watching. Violet had started noticing other Draxi in the corridors when she made her way to and from the quarters. Warriors, all of them, with that same predatory stillness that made her hindbrain scream. They never approached, never spoke, just observed. The one she saw most often was the massive warrior from that first night. She'd learned his name through overhead gossip. Grit, commander of the elite guard, personal friend to Moran, and reportedly the most decorated combat veteran in 3 generations. He watched her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve with violence. "Does Commander Grit have something against humans?" Violet asked Moran one evening, after the cubs had finally agreed to sleep instead of demanding chapter after chapter. Moran's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement. Grit has something against anything he doesn't understand. And you, Violet, confuse him greatly. I'm really not that complicated. Tired, caffeinated, occasionally competent. That's the whole package. You're a prey species who walks into predator dens without fear. You make yourself vulnerable in ways that violate every tactical principle my people value. And my cubs adore you. Moran's amber eyes held hers. Yes, that confuses him. Should I be worried? About Grit? No. He's overprotective, not dangerous. At least, not to those under my protection. Moran paused. But I should tell you, his interest isn't entirely personal. That sounded ominous. Violet waited. Other warriors have noticed the cubs' progress. Their language skills, yes, but more than that. Their demeanor. They're calmer, more focused. They ask questions instead of simply attacking problems. Moran's claws flexed unconsciously. Some of the younger warriors have started asking about your teaching methods. I just read to them. It's not exactly revolutionary pedagogy. Perhaps not to humans, but to Draxi? Moran's expression turned serious. We are warriors, Violet. We have been warriors for so long that we've forgotten we were ever anything else. Our cubs are trained from birth to be strong, to be fierce, to never show weakness. And it has made us formidable, yes, but also isolated. Violet thought about the Draxi delegation's quarters, how they were always separate, always apart. How other species gave them wide berths in the corridors, respect mixed with fear. The cubs, Moran continued, are learning something we stopped teaching generations ago. That strength can be quiet. That questions aren't weakness. That caring for something doesn't make you vulnerable. It makes you complete. That's a lot of weight to put on bedtime stories. Is it? Moran tilted his head. You've given them more in 3 weeks than their combat instructors gave them in 3 years. You've given them permission to be children. Violet didn't know what to say to that. So she did what she always did when emotions got complicated. Deflected. Well, Chapter 15 is coming up, and that's when the bear shows up. Fair warning, Fawn's going to lose her mind. Moran's rumbling laugh followed her out into the corridor, where, naturally, Commander Grit was waiting. He didn't move as she approached, just stood there like a particularly judgmental statue. Up close, he was even more intimidating than from a distance. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle, medals adorned his chest plate, and his eyes held the kind of cold assessment that made Violet's survival instincts scream. "Commander," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Human." His standard galactic was perfect, each word precisely shaped. "You spend much time with the ambassador's cubs." "That's kind of the point of tutoring, yeah. They are warriors in training, future leaders of our people." "They're kids. They can be both." Something flickered in Grit's eyes. Anger, maybe, or confusion. Possibly both. "You teach them softness, stories of friendship and cooperation. These are not Draxi values." Violet was tired. She was always tired. And tired Violet had significantly less patience for posturing than rested Violet. "With respect, Commander, if you want to criticize my teaching methods, take it up with Ambassador Moran. He hired me. I'm just the human with the book. You make them weak. I make them think. If that's weakness in your culture, that's a you problem, not a them problem." Oh, that was definitely the wrong thing to say to a decorated war hero. Grit's claws extended slightly, his posture shifting into something that made every prey instinct Violet possessed scream at her to run. But she'd learned something important over the past 3 weeks. Running from Draxi was like running from any predator. It just made them chase you. So she stood there, book clutched to her chest like the world's least effective shield, and met his eyes. The standoff lasted approximately 5 seconds, which felt like 5 hours. Then Grit made a sound that might have been a growl or might have been a laugh. "You have courage, human. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless. I'll take what I can get. The cubs speak of you constantly. The clever fox, the proud wolves, the great bear. They recite passages to each other when they think no one is listening." His expression was unreadable. "They mimic your inflections, your gestures, your humanity." Violet wasn't sure if that was accusation or observation. Kids are like that. They absorb everything. "Precisely." Grit leaned closer, his voice dropping to something that made her bones vibrate. "What are you teaching them, truly?" "To read, to think, to question." Violet met his eyes, and apparently that sometimes the scariest thing in the room is just scared itself. Grit pulled back like she'd slapped him. Violet immediately regretted every word. "I didn't mean—" "No." Grit's voice was rough. "Perhaps you did. Perhaps we all should." He straightened, his military bearings sliding back into place like armor. "Continue your sessions, human. But know that you are watched. If you harm those cubs—" "I won't. See that you don't." He walked away, silent as shadows, leaving Violet trembling in the corridor with her book and her racing heart. Back in her quarters, she collapsed onto her bunk and stared at the ceiling. This was supposed to be simple. Read to some alien kids, help with language immersion, maybe build some cultural bridges. Instead, she was apparently challenging the entire Draxi warrior philosophy with stories about talking animals. Her comm device pinged. A message from Moran. "Tomorrow, usual time? The cubs are convinced the bear is secretly kind." Despite everything, Violet smiled. Tomorrow. And spoiler alert, the bear's just hungry and misunderstood. Aren't we all? The thing about Exhaustion, Violet had learned over her months in space was that it accumulated like interest on a loan you never agreed to. One late night became two, became a week of 4-hour sleep cycles, became her new baseline of functional enough. The incident at Docking Bay 3 hadn't helped. A Quelix transport had arrived with incorrect atmosphere specs, which meant Violet had spent 6 hours mediating between panicking dock workers and increasingly aggressive Quelix traders, who kept threatening to demonstrate their displeasure through what their translator unhelpfully rendered as aggressive friendship rituals. Then the mess hall synthesizers had malfunctioned, producing something that looked like protein paste but smelled like regret. That had taken another 3 hours to sort out, including a memorable conversation with the head chef about why humans couldn't simply adapt their olfactory preferences. By the time 1900 hours rolled around, Violet had been awake for approximately 36 hours straight. Her coffee had gone from cold to room temperature to potentially sentient. Her eyes felt like they'd been replaced with sandpaper, and her ability to form coherent sentences was hanging on by sheer spite. But the cubs were waiting. So, Violet dragged herself to the Draxi quarters, book tucked under her arm, trying to remember if she'd eaten anything that day besides stimulant tablets and disappointment. Moran opened the door, took one look at her, and his ears flattened with concern. "Violet, you look unwell." "I look efficient," Violet corrected, pushing past him. "There's a difference. Where are the monsters?" "We are not monsters," Fawn announced, appearing from behind a partition. "Monsters are in stories. We are apex predators." Same energy, different marketing. Violet dropped onto the floor in her usual spot, which took more effort than it should have. Everything felt heavy. Ready for the big chapter? The bear showdown? Lynx materialized beside her, studying her face with unsettling intensity. "You smell wrong, like stress hormones and stimulants." "That's just my natural perfume. Very expensive. Can't buy it anywhere." Violet opened the book, squinting at the pages. When had the letters gotten so small? "Okay, chapter 15. This is the good stuff." Moran hesitated in the doorway. "Perhaps we should postpone." "No," both cubs said simultaneously. "See? Democracy in action. Now shush. The fox is about to do something incredibly stupid and brave, which is basically her brand." Violet started reading, her voice rougher than usual but still finding the rhythm. The story had reached its climax, where the fox and wolves finally confronted the great bear that had been terrorizing the forest. Not with violence, but with understanding. With questions about why the bear was angry, what had driven him from his home, what he truly needed versus what he thought he wanted. It was, Violet had always thought, a pretty transparent metaphor about conflict resolution. But the cubs loved it, leaning forward as the tension built. "The fox stepped forward," Violet read, her eyes getting heavy. Small and seemingly insignificant before the bear's massive form. But she didn't cower. She didn't flee. She simply asked, "What hurt you so badly that you forgot how to be gentle?" Fawn made a small sound. Lynx's tail had gone completely still. Violet kept reading, her voice starting to drift. And the bear, this creature of rage and loneliness, this thing everyone feared, he paused. Because no one, in all his years of anger, had ever asked him that question. The words were swimming now. Violet blinked hard, trying to focus. The bear said, "I was gentle once, and gentleness got me nothing but scars." The fox nodded, like she understood something profound. "Scars mean you survived. They mean you were soft enough to be hurt and strong enough to heal. That's not weakness. That's—" Violet's voice trailed off. The book was getting heavier, or her hands were getting weaker. Same result. That's what? Fawn prompted softly. That's... Violet's eyes closed, just for a second, just to rest them. That's proof you're alive. The book slipped from her fingers. Somewhere far away, she heard Moran's concerned rumble, felt the cubs shift. Around her, should probably get up, should definitely finish the chapter. The bear's revelation was important, the moment where everything changed. But her body had other ideas, and those ideas involved unconsciousness. Violet fell asleep sitting up, head tilting forward, completely and utterly vulnerable in a room with apex predators. The cubs froze. Fawn looked at her brother, ears swiveling with confusion. Why did she stop? She's sleeping, Lynx whispered, like speaking too loud might shatter something fragile. Moran moved forward, concern etched into every line of his body. I'll carry her to medical. She's overworked herself to exhaustion. But before he could reach down, both cubs moved. It wasn't coordinated, it wasn't planned, it was pure instinct, something genetic and ancient and completely contrary to everything they'd been taught about prey species and weakness. Fawn curled against Violet's left side. Lynx pressed against her right. Their bodies formed a living barrier, their obsidian fur stark against Violet's pale uniform. Cubs, Moran said gently, move aside. She needs proper care. No, Fawn said, and there was something in her voice that made even Moran pause. She's vulnerable. We guard. She's not Pack. She's not even Draxi. She's ours, Lynx said simply, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Their purring started simultaneously, that deep rumbling sound that Draxi cubs made when content, or, in some ancient evolutionary memory, when protecting wounded pack members. The vibration was soothing, instinctive, designed to calm and heal. Violet made a small sound, shifting slightly. The cubs adjusted instantly, supporting her weight, keeping her upright and warm. Moran stared at his children, something complicated warring across his features. Pride, yes, but also something like grief, like he was watching them remember something his entire generation had forgotten. Stay with them, he said finally. I'll return shortly. He stepped into the corridor, pulling the door closed behind him. His personal guard stood at attention, along with several others who'd gathered at the unusual hour. And Commander Grit, because of course Grit was there. The warrior was always there, watching, assessing, probably cataloging every breach of protocol. The human fell asleep during her duties, one of the younger guards said, not quite managing to hide his disdain. Weakness. She's been awake for 2 rotation cycles managing that docking crisis, another guard countered. That's not weakness. That's poor resource management by the ship's administrators. The cubs are fine, Moran interrupted, his voice carrying command weight. And not to be disturbed. Grit's eyes narrowed. What's happening in there? Moran hesitated, then stepped aside slightly. The door had a transparency setting, rarely used but currently activated. Through it, the guards could see into the dimly lit quarters. What they saw made every warrior go, completely still. Violet, small and defenseless, unconscious in the center of the room, and the cubs, fierce and protective, curled around her like she was the most precious thing in the galaxy. Fawn's claws were extended slightly, ready. Lynx's ears were swiveling, tracking every sound in the corridor. They looked like guards, like warriors, like Pack. By the ancestors, someone breathed. Grit moved closer to the transparency, his expression unreadable. They're protecting her. Yes, but she's prey. Weak. Helpless. Is she? Moran's voice was quiet. Or have we simply forgotten what true strength looks like? One of the younger warriors, a female named Dal, spoke up hesitantly. My grandmother used to tell stories, before the wars, when we were different. She said we used to guard our vulnerable, that protection was the highest honor. That's nursery talk, another guard scoffed. We're warriors, not caretakers. And what are warriors without something to care for? Moran challenged. We've become so focused on strength that we've forgotten why strength matters. Look at my cubs. They're not being weak. They're being exactly what they should be. Grit stood motionless, watching the scene inside. His expression was complicated, layers of conditioning warring with something deeper. They'll be mocked, called soft. By who? Those who've forgotten what it means to be complete? Moran's claws flexed. I'd rather my cubs be mocked and whole than praised and hollow. Inside the quarters, Violet shifted again, mumbling something incomprehensible. The cubs adjusted instantly, their purring increasing in volume. Fawn rested her head on Violet's shoulder. Lynx pressed closer, sharing warmth. It was, objectively, the most un-Draxi thing any of them had ever witnessed. And it was beautiful. Grit watched for another long moment, then turned away from the transparency. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I'll post guards. No one disturbs them until the human wakes naturally. Commander, one of the guards began. That's an order. Grit's tone left no room for argument. And if anyone questions it, send them to me. I'll explain proper security protocols in very small words. The guards dispersed to their positions. Moran nodded his gratitude to Grit, who ignored it completely because emotional acknowledgement was apparently still a bridge too far. But as Grit took his position outside the door, settling into the patient stillness of a career soldier, something in his posture had changed. He wasn't just guarding the ambassador's quarters anymore. He was guarding something precious, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness, about warriors and worth. Inside, completely unaware of the philosophical crisis she was causing, Violet slept on. Her breathing was even, her expression peaceful for the first time in days. The cub's purring created a cocoon of sound, soothing and safe. Fawn's eyes opened briefly, meeting her father's gaze through the transparency. She didn't move, didn't disturb Violet, just looked at him with an expression that was far too knowing for a cub her age. Then she closed her eyes again, pressing closer to the sleeping human, and resumed her vigil. In the corridor, Moran felt something shift in his chest. His cubs were learning, yes, learning language, learning culture, learning all the things he'd hoped. But they were also teaching, reminding their entire species of something lost. That care wasn't weakness. That protection was purpose. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was be vulnerable enough to sleep in a room full of predators, trusting them to guard your dreams. Violet snored softly, completely oblivious to the revolution she'd accidentally started. And the great warship Dawnbreaker sailed on through the stars, carrying within it the smallest, strangest, most important lesson the galaxy had learned in generations. Sometimes the weakest thing in the room was actually the strongest. And sometimes warriors needed to remember how to be gentle. The bear's answer would have to wait until morning. But somehow, Violet had already taught everyone the ending. Violet woke up confused, warm, and pretty sure she'd died and gone to some kind of weird afterlife that smelled like cinnamon and ozone. Then she realized the warmth was breathing and purring and had claws. Her eyes snapped open. Fawn and Lynx were still curled around her, both deeply asleep, their obsidian fur rising and falling in synchronized rhythm. Sunlight, well, artificial ship lighting that pretended to be sunlight, streamed through the viewport. Morning. It was morning. She'd fallen asleep, on the job, with the ambassador's cubs, who were now using her as a combination pillow and heating pad. "Oh no," Violet whispered. "Oh no, no, no." Lynx's ear twitched. One amber eye opened, focusing on her with that unnerving intensity. "You're awake." "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I was supposed to finish the chapter, and I just—" "You were exhausted," Fawn mumbled, not opening her eyes. "We protected you, like the wolves protected the fox in Chapter 9. "You? What?" "Protected," Fawn repeated, like it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "You were vulnerable. We guarded." Violet's brain, still fuzzy from actual rest, tried to process this. "You stayed here all night?" "Obviously." Lynx stretched, claws extending and retracting. "Where else would we go? Your beds? Your anywhere that wasn't babysitting an unconscious human?" "Not babysitting," Fawn corrected primly. "Guarding. There's a difference. Babysitting is for weak things. Guarding is for precious things." Violet felt something crack in her chest. "Aye, guys, that's—" The door opened. Moran entered carrying what looked like breakfast, followed by Commander Grit, whose expression was absolutely unreadable. "Good morning," Moran said, like this was completely normal. "I trust you slept well?" Violet tried to stand, realized her legs had fallen asleep, and ended up doing an awkward half-crawl away from the cubs. "Ambassador, I am so incredibly sorry. I violated every professional standard. I put your cubs at risk. I made my children feel useful for the first time in their lives," Moran interrupted gently. "Gave them purpose beyond combat training. Showed them what it means to care for another being." He set down the breakfast tray. "Why are you apologizing?" "Because I fell asleep. I was weak, vulnerable, completely useless." Grit made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been suppressed laughter. "Interesting definition of useless. The cubs maintained vigil for 8 hours. Didn't move except to adjust your position when you started to slump. Growled at me when I checked on you at midnight." Violet looked at Fawn and Lynx, who were now wrestling over what looked like a protein cube. "You growled at Commander Grit?" "He was being threatening," Fawn said through a mouthful of food. "We warned him appropriately." "She nearly took off my hand," Grit added, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now. "Told me that disturbing a sleeping pack member was grounds for disciplinary action." What?" Lynx looked up, completely unbothered. "You're pack now, obviously. We claimed you when we chose to guard." "That's not how it works," Violet said weakly. "That's exactly how it works," Moran corrected. "In old Draxi culture, before we became purely martial, pack bonds were chosen through acts of protection. My cubs have claimed you, which means, by traditional law, you're family." Violet sat down hard. "I came here to teach language." "And you taught us so much more," Moran said quietly. "You showed my cubs that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help, or in your case, simply needing help, doesn't diminish worth, that protection is reciprocal. I showed them I can't manage my schedule." "You showed them humanity," Grit said, and coming from him it sounded almost reverent. "Real, flawed, exhausted humanity. And they responded with their own humanity, the part we've been training out of them for generations." Violet looked between the 3 adult Draxi, then at the cubs who'd gone back to wrestling, and felt like she'd stumbled into an alternate dimension. "I don't understand what's happening." "Change," Moran said simply. "You're happening. And you've caused quite the stir." That sounded ominous. What kind of stir? Grit and Moran exchanged glances. Grit spoke first. 12 warriors have requested story sessions. For themselves. Excuse me? They've heard about your teaching methods. About how the cubs have improved. About, well, Grit looked almost embarrassed. About the stories themselves. Several guards were monitoring last night. They heard Fawn reciting passages to keep you calm. The part about the bear and gentleness and scars. It resonated, Moran added, rather strongly. With warriors? Actual, combat-trained, apex predator warriors? We're warriors, Grit said slowly. But we're also people. And your stories, they remind us of something we lost. They're not just tales for cubs. They're tactical manuals for peace. Violet blinked. They're just stories about talking animals. Are they? Moran's amber eyes were intense. Or are they frameworks for understanding conflict, for building bridges, for remembering that strength comes in many forms? Before Violet could respond, an alarm chimed. Moran's expression darkened as he checked his communicator. We have visitors. Ironfang Coalition. They've requested an audience. That's not good, Grit muttered. Who's the Ironfang Coalition? Violet asked. Opposition party. They believe our peace talks are weakness. They've been vocal about their displeasure. Moran's claws flexed. I need to meet with them. Violet, you should return to your quarters. And miss the drama? I'm already in whatever this is up to my neck. As if summoned by narrative convenience, the door chimed. A younger warrior poked his head in. Ambassador, the Coalition demands to see you immediately. They're in the main conference bay, and they specifically requested the human be present. Absolutely not, Grit said immediately. Why do they want me? Violet asked, though she had a sinking feeling she knew. The warrior looked uncomfortable. They've heard about the cubs, about the stories. They're calling it cultural contamination. They want to demonstrate why Draxi shouldn't adopt their words, prey mentality. It's a trap, Grit stated flatly. Obviously, Moran agreed. Which is why Violet will remain here, under guard, while I... No. Violet stood up, her exhaustion replaced by something that felt suspiciously like anger. If they're using me as an excuse to undermine the peace talks, I should be there. I can defend my own teaching methods. They won't want to debate, Grit warned. They'll want to humiliate, to prove humans are weak and corrupting. Then, let them try. Violet crossed her arms. I've been doing this job for 8 months. I've handled aggressive Quelix, territorial Norgath, and a diplomatic incident involving fermented proteins that I'm still not allowed to talk about. I can handle some posturing warriors. Moran studied her for a long moment. You understand they may challenge you. Draxi challenges are not metaphorical. I understand I'm tired of people mistaking kindness for weakness. Violet picked up her book. Let's go have a conversation about story time. The conference bay was packed. Warriors lined the walls, their amber eyes tracking every movement. At the center stood a massive Draxi, who made even Grit look small. His armor was decorated with kill marks, his scars were extensive, and his expression promised violence. Dorn, Moran said evenly, you requested this meeting. I requested truth, Dorn rumbled, his eyes fixed on Violet like she was prey. This is the human? The one teaching our cubs prey philosophy? I teach language through literature, Violet said, proud her voice didn't shake. It's a proven educational method. You teach weakness, softness. You poison future warriors with tales of friendship and cooperation. I teach critical thinking, empathy, cultural understanding. You teach them to be victims. Dorn moved forward, each step deliberate. Draxi are predators. We take what we want. We dominate. We don't make friends with our food. Murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors, some approving, some uncertain. Violet felt the weight of every eye in the room, felt the trap closing. This wasn't about education. This was about proving that humans, that peace, that anything soft was worthless. She could back down, apologize, leave. Or, you want to talk about strength? Violet stepped forward, book clutched to her chest. Fine, let's talk about it. Real strength, not just the ability to hit things. Dorn's eyes narrowed. Careful, human. The strongest thing I've ever seen, Violet continued, her voice gaining confidence, was Ambassador Moran asking for help with his cubs, admitting he didn't have all the answers. That's terrifying for someone in power, isn't it? Being vulnerable enough to say, I need help. That's weakness, Dorn spat. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, pretending you're invincible all the time seems exhausting and stupid. Real strength is knowing your limits and working anyway. Real strength is choosing not to fight when you could win. Real strength is... Enough words. Dorn's claws extended. You speak of strength, but embody weakness. Prove your philosophy has worth. Face me. Traditional challenge. Prove that your softness is anything but prey waiting to die. The room went silent. Violet's heart hammered. This was it. The moment where everything she'd said would be tested against claws and teeth and centuries of warrior culture. She could surrender. Walk away. Admit defeat. Or she could do something incredibly stupid. Okay, Violet said, but not your rules. Mine.